there's been this sort of genocidal strain to, militant black leftist politics in South Africa for decades now. Now it just so happens that those people are in power.
Marco Rubio is boycotting the G20 meeting in South Africa because of his concerns around the far-left government in South Africa. Can you talk a bit about what's happening there and how this is a bit of a change in US foreign policy?
Yeah, this has been a sort of on the margins of American politics, particularly American right-wing politics issue for some time. Anyone who's sort of in right-wing circles is probably at least marginally familiar with what's happening to the Boers, the white Afrikaner minority in South Africa. Since the apartheid government fell, the white minority government, and it became run by predominantly left-wing black parties, they started increasingly radically and extremely discriminating in all kinds of different ways against the white minority. And there's also been this huge uptick in violence and the farm murders, et cetera, which in some ways are sort of pseudo-state sanctioned. The state certainly isn't interested in protecting these people. There's a fascinating graph that shows the rate of racial laws in South Africa. And you've got, race laws staying pretty steady during the apartheid era. They decline directly after apartheid, and then they jump right back up to even higher levels than the apartheid era, just in the inverse. So for obvious reasons, this is something that Western governments have effectively ignored. They've pretended that it doesn't happen or isn't happening for some time, because it is obviously when they talk about human rights, they're not talking about human rights for white people, they're talking about human rights for aggrieved minorities. Trump talked about it a little bit during his first term, and he put out a tweet which was very controversial at the time, saying I've asked then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to look into this, but nothing really came of it. It caused a week-long outrage cycle, and then it kind of disappeared. So this is the first time, I think, to this degree that almost any Western government, but certainly the United States, has actually taken material, substantive steps, not just to recognize that this is happening to the Boers, but to actually do something about it.
I think what sparked this was a recent law passed by the president of South Africa, which allows for the government essentially to take farmers' land without giving them any kind of compensation if it's in the so-called public interest. And this isn't well defined. They talk about whether this is, being in the public interest, this is good for inclusivity and for helping the government get natural resources. That was part of the law. So it just seems bizarre that they're able to get away with essentially stealing land from white farmers and giving it to the government. Do you think the people in the State Department are looking at this quite closely? What might they do to try and sort of sanction South Africa if there will be any sanctions?
I do think they're actually looking at it quite closely, and I don't have any particular unique insight into specifically the conversations that are happening in the State Department, but it's remarkable how similarly the left works in every developed country, where as soon as Trump mentioned South Africa, all of a sudden every sort of media outlet in South Africa, all of the major politicians started saying, no, that's misinformation, that's disinformation. That's not even close to what the expropriation law is about. It has nothing to do with that. You have nothing to be concerned about. Of course, we're not going to be expropriating land from white farmers. Of course, anyone who knows even a little bit about how the South African government has behaved towards this minority over the last couple of decades should be skeptical of the fact that that's actually true. But regardless, the South African government has on the books all kinds of institutional, extraordinarily aggressive modes of discrimination, specifically racial in character, against the Boer, the Afrikaner minority. So if human rights means anything, if the State Department's purported commitment to human rights across the globe means anything, the South African government is committing a violation of human rights, and the State Department should be pursuing the kinds of sanctions or other sort of consequences for those human rights abuses that they do against other governments that commit similar human rights abuses.
And are you encouraged by the fact that Elon Musk, obviously he has a big influence with Trump at the moment, and he was tweeting about this issue as well? He is from South Africa originally, and you get the sense that he is also quite concerned about, and this government in South Africa is very left-wing, it's radically left. As you say, it's doing all sorts of things. And there's that video of people, screaming, "Kill the boar, kill the boar." The atmosphere in South Africa is very nasty towards a lot of the white population.
Absolutely, yeah. My grandmother is actually British South African, not super political, but she grew up at the sort of end of the apartheid era, and she's not like a pro-apartheid partisan or anything. They run a charity for disadvantaged kids in one of the townships there. But she remembers stories right around the time of the end of apartheid where like ANC people would walk around with shirts that said like "one settler, one bullet," right? Like there's been this sort of genocidal strain to militant black leftist politics in South Africa for decades now. Now it just so happens that those people are in power. And if you look at that video of them chanting "kill the boar," it doesn't seem like that strain has disappeared. It just has the force of the state behind it now. So I would be very concerned if I was an Afrikaner right now, and I think they are very concerned. And the attempt post the State Department statements and the Trump statements to basically whitewash this and to say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what's going on in South Africa. This is just about equity, or this is just a very sort of moderate bill." That's obviously not true if you actually listen to what these people are saying.
Does that make you think that the left's goal in the United States and in the West is to become more like South Africa, to become more like the South African government in its attitude towards the white population? Because in the US and in the UK, demographically, we will become white minority countries within, potentially our lifetimes. So it's interesting to see what happens when the minority, when whites become a minority in a country. Perhaps we're heading towards South Africa.
Well, it's undeniable that at least certain strains of the left in the West very much want to have a government that resembles the kinds of things that the South African government is doing. That's one of the reasons they're running cover for the South African government, right? If they didn't want to be like the South African government, they wouldn't be so committed to defending everything the South African government is doing. But it's also true again, it was very interesting to watch the South African government and the sort of media mouthpieces over the last few weeks try to basically run cover, to man the emergency stations to try to come up with a sort of public rationale for what they're doing. They appropriated very familiar language to anyone who's familiar with the left in the West. The language they use: diversity, equity, inclusion, white privilege, rectifying past wrongs, like all of the same sort of ideological frameworks that we hear to use to justify DEI, anti-white discrimination, et cetera, in the West. Very much the same language there. So I think, a lot of these people are clearly reading from the same books, and I think that was especially apparent over the last few weeks.
There has been a bit of a focus on anti-white discrimination in the US. Jeremy Carl wrote this fantastic book about it. He's an academic. And particularly from Republican Trump politicians, they have called out a lot of this racism against white people. Are you encouraged that the Trump administration is trying to shut down some of this anti-white discrimination, particularly in his executive orders against DEI?
Absolutely. I mean, for sort of bizarre reasons, for a long time in Republican circles and mainstream conservative circles, the phrase anti-white was unacceptable, right? It was the kind of thing that most mainstream conservatives were afraid to use. They'd say DEI is bad because it violates the principle of colorblind equality, or even more absurdly, they say DEI is bad because it hurts Asians, or anyone. It hurts any number of sort of groups except for white people, because I think there's this sort of pathological aversion to, even wanting to seem like in any way, shape, or form you were speaking for white people, right? Because then that starts to sound like Nazism or something, which is obviously absurd. White people are being systemically discriminated against by all of these Western governments. And if you actually believe in the principle of colorblind equality, which all of these people say they do, well, that's a violation of the principle of colorblind equality. You don't have to be a white nationalist to be against anti-white discrimination. So that sort of Overton window is broken now. I think the limits on that no longer exist. And you heard Trump on the campaign trail. There was, I think it was a Rolling Stone cover where like the front page quote from him was about anti-white discrimination. So it has clearly become something that is now okay to talk about. And that's a good thing, Because again, if we actually want to fight for something like meritocracy or colorblind equality or whatever it is, the number one victims of the sort of anti-colorblind, anti-equality movement right now are white people in places like America and the UK.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the GBN America YouTube channel.